One of my favorite things about New Frontiers is that we have a panel of people who are looking at the current issues today, trying to help give you some agency. Today, we're going to be talking about Russia as well as what's happening in Israel, a variety of different issues, dropping in consumer confidence. But what you're going to find as a commonality is that we try to look at the upside and the downside to any of these positions, not trying to just be a critic of Trump or a supporter of Trump and the things that he's doing, but trying to help you really understand those ideas better. Now, we have a new book that's come out that's called What's Right with America. If you're looking for one of those books that tells you all the things that are going wrong with our country, this isn't the book that you want to buy. This is a book that talks about how, over a long trajectory, we've been doing the right thing in America, and it has made a significant impact on not only Americans' lives, but lives throughout the world. Now, I'm just an ordinary, optimistic American who still believes that the United States is a great cause for good. If you like what it is that we're doing, push that subscribe button, or even better, go on Amazon or Barnes & Noble and pre-order one of our books that will be out in June. So again, if you like what we're doing, push that subscribe button. Let's get going.
Destiny. Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. 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 You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Put this in the category of the Johnson Brothers stories. I have 9 brothers, or 9 brothers and sisters, excuse me. Sometimes I think I have 9 brothers because my sisters act a lot like brothers too, but nonetheless. So we are doing this deal up in Montana. 2 of my brothers go with me, and we have to stay in one of these Motel 6s because there aren't really a lot of great options for hotels in this little tiny town that we're going to in Montana. So we go inside there, and had 2 beds, and we've got a little shower, and we've got to get ready. We're supposed to go out for a cowboy dinner out at one of the ranches. And when my one brother goes in the room, he goes, I got to go to the bathroom really bad. So he goes into the bathroom, and my other brother and I are outside, and my other brother wants to take a shower, so he keeps pounding on the door. And finally, when my younger brother comes out of the bathroom, the other brother goes in. I guess it smells really bad, so he's going, God dang, I can't believe this, right? He's all mad about it. So in any event, he finally gets the courage up and he goes in and he starts to take a shower. Well, what he didn't know is that my brother, while he was in there, took some of those little round coffee things that they have that are like little clear filters, and he'd stuffed them down in the bathtub, the drain of the bathtub. So my other brother's is in the shower, and the water's filling up about halfway up on his shins, and he looks down at the drain and he sees this black stuff coming up through the drain. We hear him start screaming. He comes out there, he goes, I'm gonna kill you. He was just convinced that it was related to the bad smell that he had had a little bit earlier. So any event, that's the Johnson story for the day. Now, I'm going to go around the table here, and I'll start with Bob, my favorite columnist. Bob, welcome back to the New Frontiers. Thanks for being here today.
Always good to be with you.
And then Elliot, you've been doing these like grand vacations all over the world. Where was the last one again?
St. Bart's.
St. Bart's.
In the French West Indies.
You recommend it?
Oh, it's great. Just great. All I can tell you is bring lots of money. That's the unfortunate thing. Everything there is insanely expensive.
Yeah, all imported, I bet.
Yeah, maybe not as expensive as the motel in Montana you were talking about, but pretty close.
Yeah, that hotel was a special one. And then Lord Henry. Henry, welcome back to the show. Henry, you and I did a podcast last week. We had Mark Mecker on the show, who was focused on this idea of a Congress of states. Mainly, it's a rewriting of the Constitution. They've made some real traction. They've now gotten it down to where they've passed in 19 states and trying to work on others. Maybe we'll start the show by talking about that concept. I thought that was interesting. I mean, I'm not a big supporter of it, but nonetheless, what was your thoughts of it?
I was kind of taken aback that this initiative was even really underway. I was not really aware that this even was a provision in the Constitution. Unlike you, Paul, you'd done more background research than I had. So I was kind of amazed at how far they had come with it, but I don't think that there's really much potential for change. We can talk about that more, but I don't think that there's going to really be much come of their efforts. But we can talk about that maybe more in a second.
Yeah, they've got 19 states that have passed it. By the way, I thought Mark did a great job of presenting his side, even though I disagree with him. I thought that he's a lawyer. He's very smart. He actually started the Tea Party movement, or one of the main guys that started the Tea Party movement. So I wouldn't discount him completely. They're going to be in front of a number of other states. They've got to get to 34 states to be successful. But my read of what they were really interested in doing at the end of the day is they don't they see themselves as a conservative movement, and I don't think that Mark didn't say this so much. I don't think they like the liberal elements in our society. So they're trying to create a system that from the front end is rigged so that the conservative end will win. They want it to be each state has one vote. Well, there are more Republican states than there are Democratic states, but of course that would mean that Montana would have exactly the same amount of proportional vote as Texas would. They don't want anything to come from kind of a populist edge. By the way, Article 5 doesn't give any instruction for how this is supposed to work. So it's very, very vague. But at the end of the day, they'd like to change this to where states had more controls than the federal government did, and they had some things that I'm actually more supportive of, like they liked a balanced budget amendment in some form. I think a balanced budget amendment would make sense. I don't know what form they're actually proposing, but that seemed to me to be the concept that they were trying to elevate. Do you agree?
Right. Yeah. The idea is to amend the Constitution through this Congress of states so that certain things are just simply not allowed to be done by the federal government, like, for example, run a deficit. I think that they're going to founder on the requirement for 34 or 36 states to agree to anything that they decide, because even if they can get, I think it was 26 states or 24 states have to agree to come together to have the meeting in the first place. I think even if 26 come together and have some sort of a decision, I don't think that you're going to find another 10 states that are going to agree with it that would allow it to move forward to amend the Constitution. So I don't think that much is going to come of the plan. But it's one of these things where you sometimes wonder whether a grassroots movement can raise awareness of certain issues at a grassroots level that might affect electoral politics without changing the Constitution as a whole.
Bob, have you heard much about this particular effort? And I know that it did pass in Arizona about a year ago. It was one of the 19 states that had passed it.
What passed in Arizona wasn't anywhere near that specific. There was a period of time in which we were close to reaching the threshold for a convention of the states to propound amendments to the Constitution over a balanced budget. But that sort of waned. And while the Constitution is pretty vague as to how this will happen, it is granted to Congress the decision over how you ratify anything that might be produced and how you would reflect the approval of 3/4 of the states, either through action by their state legislatures or through conventions. And Congress would have the authority to decide which mode of ratification would take place. I don't think it really matters which method were chosen. We are so divided politically that anything that wasn't razor focused on something that might have bipartisan appeal, such as a balanced budget amendment, although I don't support a pure balanced budget amendment, but something that wasn't that laser focused, I don't think would have any hope of coming anywhere close, as closely divided as we are politically, to something that would get the consent of 3/4 of the states.
All right, I'm going to jump to a series of issues. It's kind of fun with Donald Trump because, like, literally every week you can talk about the 35 issues that he espoused during the time that we were off. But Elliot, if you wanted to make a comment on the Congress of States, that'd be terrific. But what I'd like to do first, or what I'd like to do as kind of our first issue with the Trump issue, is to talk about what we saw this week on Israel. Trump made a proposal this week, and the proposal was that the United States would take over Gaza. That in taking over Gaza, that seemingly the people who lived in Gaza would be exported out. The United States, after being given Gaza, would take over redeveloping it and create resorts and those types of things. How do you, well, first, you've been a big supporter of Israel, as have I. First, I'd like to know what your thoughts are, even on the concept, and then maybe talk about whether or not you think this is just strategy or
Well,
hyperbole, or is it just a
well,
misguided?
the one thing that I can tell you after watching Trump for the last 4 weeks is that his whole it's diversion. Look over here. Here's where I want to end up, and we're probably going to move in that direction. But I'm going to come out with something so outlandish that it's going to force you to do something. And I personally think it's brilliant. These people in Gaza have been locked there. They've been locked in a combat zone for years. The Egyptians won't let them in. The Jordanians won't let them in. Other Arab states, they're locked there. They're simply stuck. And nobody wants to do anything. The two-state solution is dead. And if it did come back, there'd simply be another war in 10 or 15 years. It's a ridiculous idea. It's not going to work. So what Trump does is basically propose a solution that puts everybody on the spot. He said, if you don't like my solution, you come up with something. And my bet is something will come out of this, a movement towards something that's realistic. The day he came out with that, I was giggling all afternoon. I just thought it was a brilliant ploy to get him to where he wants to go. Do I believe he wants to put a bunch of resorts and casinos in Gaza? No, I don't. But he wants to force a solution, and this is what's going to do it.
All right. So, Bob, I think one of the areas I agree with Elliot on this, one thing that stands out to me, I mean, first, there's hypocrisy on both sides. Donald Trump's whole concept of an America First movement, why we shouldn't be engaged in foreign affairs, seemed to be turned on its head on that one. But the other thing that stood out to me was the response by Palestinians and by people in Gaza who made the comment that no, they won't go. We're not leaving. And it's like, well, wait a minute. I've heard for 10 years this is an open air prison. And now you're saying you won't leave. And that to me seems to be apocryphal as well. It seems like this issue is full of hypocrisy, at least from my standpoint.
I can't give Trump even a tenth of the credit that Elliott is vouchsafing him. I think he is serious. And I had thought that at this point in time, there was nothing associated with Donald Trump that could truly flabbergast me, but this one did. And it is so absurd that I don't think it's a starting point for anything except the continuing decline of a useful role for the United States in international affairs. It may be that the conditions in Gaza are awful, even inhabitable, but it's where Gazians want to be. Trump says we're going to build these beautiful homes for them elsewhere. Well, okay, where and who's going to build them? We're going to turn Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East. But it's not going to involve any U.S. coercion or government investment. Okay, who's going to do it? And when it's done, do we really think that a U.S. affiliated resort community in the middle of the Middle East wouldn't be the richest terrorist target perhaps in the entire world. And yet no one's willing to stand up and say, this is nuts. This is ludicrous. This depreciates the moral leadership of the United States in any taking of what a president of the United States says seriously.
It's hard to really know what to make of a lot of the things that are going on in the Trump administration. I'm sympathetic to Elliot and Bob in a way. I think that something that Elliot brought up, I think, is perhaps true, which is that we shouldn't perhaps think that Trump really means to do the things that he says that he wants to do, but that he might be just trying to shake up a sort of a stagnant equilibrium. And I think that when we talk about Ukraine and Europe, in some ways, I think that some of the things that he's saying about Ukraine are similar, that we've got these situations where they seem to be sort of like a dead end and the sort of stasis just continues. And Trump is basically saying it can't continue. So I agree with Elliot on that front that he's shaking things up. But I also agree with Bob that the way that he's proposing to shake things up and the actual concrete goal just seems pretty bad or not particularly well thought through or almost like a joke at times. And so my general assessment is we're moving into a period of disorder. I think that there's just going to be a lot of chaos or even more chaos than there has been before. But the general trend of travel, I think, is exactly as Bob said, towards a reduced American role in global affairs. What shape that's going to take, I don't know, because Trump starts by saying the US wants to take over Gaza. Who knows where that's going to land up? He says he wants peace in Ukraine. Who knows where that's going to end up, etc. Right? So I think that we're seeing a lot of pre-existing situations that have been sort of staggering on for a long time get shaken up, and the general direction is towards disengagement. But where we end up as we proceed along that journey, I don't think anybody knows, including Donald Trump.
It's impossible for me to figure out Trump's motive. I don't know if his motive is he's brilliant and he's got some other plan, or if he's just saying crazy things that that no one agrees with. I will say I think Bibi agreed with him. He seemed shocked, but then he seemed to like have this big smile on his face as he was talking about it. The thing that seems clear to me though on this is it'd be great if I thought, hey, there's really some other plan that he's really going for. That this isn't the plan, but he's going for a different plan. My problem with that is I don't see another plan. My own personal opinion is this is a problem that's been there for a very long time, certainly since 1933, and you might even argue all the way back to 2 or 3,000 years before Christ. I mean, it's been there a long time, and I don't quite believe that the United States is going to end up finding an answer to this one. In some ways, maybe the best that we're going to be able to do, in my view, is just to make certain that it doesn't boil over as best we can. But I'll give you a thought on what maybe a better idea might be.
Well, I don't know what the better idea is, neither does Trump, but he's going to force people to come up with it. He's taking 35 years of failed American policy and throwing it back on somebody else, saying, you guys figure it out because what we're doing isn't working. It's not working in Israel. It's not working in Ukraine. It's not working in Europe. It's not working anywhere. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to come up with something outlandish, although he'll play it very straight. It's not outlandish. And you figure it out. He's doing that in Europe. He's going to do it in Ukraine. He's doing it here. Can he come up with worse solutions than over the last 35 years? I doubt it. I think it would be tough to come up with a worse policy than we've had for the last 35 years. It simply failed.
Okay. All right. So let's go to Ukraine, because I think that's an important one to focus on. This week, Donald Trump gave an announcement that he had a phone call with Vladimir Putin, that he was planning on setting up a meeting. I believe that meeting was going to take place in Saudi Arabia, at least originally, with Marco Rubio and some of their staff to begin discussions on how to put together a peace plan. That was not met very well around the world. The Europeans were clearly upset about it, as was Ukraine. Their concern is that they're being cut out of the process. Now, again, it seems to me that a lot of this is based upon just a broad distrust of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. My own opinion is the Trump administration knows that. They know that there's broad distrust against him on this, and that if he goes in and reaches a peace settlement that does real damage to Ukraine, this is going to be his Afghanistan. I think at least his people understand that to be true. So I'm not altogether sure that they are going to sell out the farm. At least I'm certainly hopeful that they're not going to. But in saying that, this is one that around the world, some of the great leaders who know Donald Trump personally and who have watched the United States, they think that we are going to be selling out Ukraine.
I think it depends on what people mean by selling out Ukraine. So some people would say that having these negotiations bilaterally between the US and Russia is already a selling out of Ukraine and is unacceptable. And I think that's one of the things the Europeans are objecting to. And so I'm not surprised that that is the general tone, that people are very worried about this. Another, to be frank, another problem with this is that these sorts of negotiations already happened before the reinvasion of Ukraine and failed, right? The so-called Minsk agreements, where the conflict will be frozen with these Russian aligned groups controlling eastern Ukraine, that failed when Putin decided to try and take the capital, Kiev. And so it's not clear why it should be more successful this time than before without making some sort of additional concessions, because it's clear that America is unwilling to put American forces on the ground in Ukraine to guarantee the security agreement. So I think that there is an emerging sort of a very vague plan, I think, that the US is trying to put Europe on the spot and get Europe to commit boots on the ground, probably British, French, and I think they might try and get German troops even as well on the ground there in Ukraine to act as a sort of security backstop against any further Russian invasion of Ukraine after the agreement. But of course, the Americans aren't doing a very good job of managing those negotiations with the Europeans either. So again, I think Trump is shaking up the status quo, and the direction of travel is clear, but it's not entirely sure exactly where we're going to end up.
Secretary of Defense made comments this week in Munich, and in those comments, he seemed to lay out a position that took away most of the negotiating position away from Ukraine, but then later had to recant and give some of those things back. I'm not sure what happened. I'm not sure if Trump pushed him or if Europe pushed him, but something happened where he dropped those, or at least he began to give up on some of those ideas and to say that this was really Trump's negotiation. It seems to me the keys to being able to find peace on this, number one, you have to come up with an agreement on where the borders are. And my guess is it is fair to say you're not going to get anything that was after the 1914 lines that were drawn, or excuse me, nothing that was before that. The second issue I think that's going to be key is they need some type of security guarantee. Trump is trying to say that that security guarantee needs to be one that's given by Europe, or at least the Secretary of Defense seemed to say that. But that security guarantee seems to be key, and I don't think you can really get a deal that works unless the United States is a part of that. Now, I don't know if that means we have to have boots on the ground and Marines or people in the United States Army stationed there, but that guarantee is going to have the United States is going to have to play some role in that. What's your view of what you saw happen with the Ukraine negotiations this week?
When I read them at first, well, first of all, let me start by saying this guy's been in office for 4 weeks. He's done more to create change and to mix things up in 4 weeks than anybody since the end of World War II. It's just an amazing change of policy. I'm not sure I like it, but I don't dislike it, I'll tell you that much. I didn't like some of the things he said because I read it the same way you did. He was making concessions he didn't have to make. But this is Trump, and who knows what he'll say next Tuesday. You don't know. Like I said, he makes you focus over here, but what he really wants is over here, and it's getting that movement that really is going to determine how successful he is. Am I happy he's doing this stuff? like I said, American foreign policy has been a disaster for 35 years. And why would you continue to do the same? You know what they say about insanity? It's doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. And that's exactly what's gone on in the Middle East. It's gone on with Russia. The last thing I think we want is American troops facing Russian troops. To me, that's a recipe for disaster. And so it's going to have to be Europe. And what he's telling Europe is, you guys have been busy creating social programs with money that should have gone to defense. You know what? We're tired of paying for it. And I really do think, as you know, Bob and I were alive and well and of the perfect age for Vietnam. And I don't see that there's reason to kill another 60, 70, 80,000 American kids for some, bullshit reason. And I think that a different approach is at least warranted. I have no idea exactly how this is going to play out, but am I glad to see things being shaken up? Yeah, I am. I have no idea whether it's going to work. I have no idea how it's going to play out, but it's different, and it's basically saying we got to change from the past. That I agree with.
First, I think when it comes to foreign policy, oftentimes you're choosing between the least of bad options as opposed to what is the best of best options. It also seems to me that one of the things that we've done is we did create an American world order since the 1940s, and that there were some benefits that came to Americans in that process. I think where I would disagree with Elliot is the idea that that what we have today necessarily needed to be shook up, and that I think Elliot, though, concedes he's not sure if it's going to be better or worse. Um, my fear is that in shaking it up, we're basically shaking up what was known as an American world order. What are your thoughts on this? Do you see the shakeup that's happening in Ukraine as being something that may work out, or that Trump is going to be inclined towards wanting to make certain that it's a fair deal, or do you see him more inclined towards trying to give away the store?
I'm not sure what his objective is. I know that he does not believe in a rules-based order, American-led, such as you described. He believes in great power politics, and he's made that plain. But our approach in Ukraine is absolutely incoherent, and it contributes to the decline of any acceptance of American leadership for whatever purpose. So our Secretary of Defense goes to Europe and says the security guarantees for Ukraine have to come entirely from Europe, not involving the United States, and not as part of NATO. Then Trump's envoy setting up these negotiations says, well, the Europeans aren't going to have a seat at the table. Well, if we're looking for the Europeans to provide the security guarantees, they're not going to have a seat at the table in the discussions. And while our Secretary of Defense is saying there's going to be no U.S. involvement in any security guarantees that are provided for Ukraine, our Secretary of the Treasury is providing a piece of paper to the president of Ukraine asking for 50% ownership of critical metals in the country in exchange for security guarantees, presumably by the United States. I think the lesson that Europe is finally learning is that it cannot depend upon the United States anymore. And I believe that lesson will reverberate. I think it will be learned by the countries in the Indo-Pacific. And I believe we are going to have a significant geopolitical realignment. What form that takes, I don't know. But I must say, the rich irony of brokering the future of a aspiring democracy like Ukraine in direct negotiations with Putin in Saudi Arabia, I think is rich.
Yeah, that is interesting. All right. So I'm going to use this as an ability to transition to a new topic, which is DOGE. Bob, you and I have had a little bit of disagreement on this one. I think we both kind of want the same thing. Would love to see the federal government actually make cuts. You're much more suspect of whether DOGE will be successful or not. I actually think that they may be successful. Now, there were a number of issues this week. Everything from the offer buyout that went to different employees, the press conference with Elon Musk and Donald Trump, where Elon brought his son X, and they were talking about the cuts that were taking place. I tend to agree with you on the temperament, and it does seem to be messy. But I actually think that they're making some progress in terms of cuts. I think we're up to 250,000 potential cuts. Now, it is also possible those get put back by a judge going forward in the future. I'm going to tell you my challenge, where I become challenged with DOGE, and at least at this point, my fears aren't being realized. But my greatest fear is that they get to the point that they make a decision not to go along with what the courts say. If you look at the issues as they relate to the courts, you go back to 1960, Richard Nixon had a challenge with the Kennedy election. He could have definitely challenged it and pushed it, but decided to reside within the rule of law. You can move forward to later on with Watergate. Who knows why he gave those tapes up? But my guess is giving those tapes up had to do with the fact that he was ordered by a court to do it. Later, you had Al Gore, who was in a position where the United States Supreme Court made a decision. I don't think he thought it was right or fair. I think he thought he actually had won Florida, but he followed the rule of law. Following the rule of law becomes important. And again, Henry and I have done a couple of interviews now with people that, to me, that should become even more clear to people who are in technology, because there are another group of people who are resentful of people who are in the technology field. And the only thing that they really will have to protect them at the end of the day is that Constitution. If that breaks on this one, that's a problem that I think is actually bigger than the budget. The idea that if a president disagrees with a judge, he can disagree all he wants, but he has to follow the court order. Now, to Trump's credit, so far he said that he is going to do that. Any event, give me your thoughts on where you think DOGE is today, and whether or not you think they've been successful, and whether or not you're worried about them actually creating a constitutional crisis.
I am deeply worried about that, not only with respect to DOGE, but with respect to a wide variety of policy initiatives that Trump has engaged in. And he has a vice president who flatly said that the president should defy a court order and cite Andrew Jackson's injunction that, okay, the Supreme Court has now ruled, let them enforce it. So I think we are at potentially very dangerous grounds. DOGE, I think, is already a disaster. You have this rogue force wreaking havoc through the federal government. You have what I've described as over-caffeinated graduate students getting access to classified materials for which they are not been vetted or approved. And when I said that, I thought I was doing a caricature of who they are. As it turns out, there's actually some over-caffeinated undergraduates who are doing this work. And now they're going to go in the Defense Department. And Elon Musk believes that he is the geopolitical strategist that can decide what kind of fighting air warplanes we should have. And we don't need the F-35 because we can just get swarms of drones to do all of that for us. There's a rich opportunity to make the federal government more productive. And if Musk was limiting himself to technology issues, I think there might be some use to him. But if you're going to try to make the federal government more productive, then you should appoint qualified cabinet officials who are qualified and knowledgeable, who can go through the painstaking work of doing that the right way. Instead, he's nominated incompetent nincompoops to run these agencies, and then turned Elon Musk free to roam randomly through any agency for any purpose, acquiring all sorts of information, accumulating conflict of interest over conflict of interest, violating law after law. I think it's already a disaster, and I think bigger implosions are about to begin.
I couldn't disagree more. Okay? By the way, were you making these statements when Biden was thumbing his nose at the Constitution and the Supreme Court?
Yes, I was.
Well, at any rate, I don't remember you being this pissed. The bottom line is the trouble with the government. It is you've all read somewhere along the line Parkinson's law: work expands to meet time available. In this case, we have this bureaucracy that's basically 200 some odd years old, and it's out of control. Nobody knows what's necessary and what's not. Plus, I think you're all overlooking the fact that everybody was in favor of it, and now just the Republicans are in favor of it. And I think when it's a Republican congressman's district that gets cut back, all of a sudden they won't be in favor of it. So I think it has a good chance of failing, but not because of what Bob's saying, just because politics is politics. And, oh, we need this person, or this person died of AIDS because he didn't get the proper treatment. All the nonsense that you're going to get out of this. And there will be some damage from this. There's no question about it. But I think Bob is incorrect. I think Musk is probably the only person on the planet who has the brain power, the $400 billion. So he's not after your money. He's already got most of the money. He doesn't need any more. And he's going to try to use his brilliance to come up with something that might work. Am I optimistic? No, because I still think politics is politics. And when it gets down to the individual locality for this congressman or this senator, all of a sudden everything else is right, but not this. And that's gonna kill it. I see what's happened with the Democrats already. They're trying that nonsense, and the media with USAID about, oh, what about these people? It's housing for AIDS and blah blah blah. Well, what about everything else? You know, unfortunately, it's going to be messy and it's going to be ugly. But you've got to do something pretty drastic to have any effect whatsoever. So while I guess the other thing is I still have faith that the founding fathers found a solution 200 and some odd years ago that'll work. And checks and balances are that solution, which is why I was so maddened by what Biden did. And we'll see what happens with Trump here, that essentially I think that all these decisions will be made at the Supreme Court. And that will determine what happens. I don't think that Trump can survive thumbing his nose at the Supreme Court for 3.5 years. I just don't. And I don't think that, and unfortunately, the precedent is Biden, not Trump. That's neither here nor there. I just think that to get anywhere, you need somebody who's so out of control that he's going to get to issues that the average person would never get to. Will it work? I'd give it 20, 25%. But is it better than what we're doing now? Once again, the government's out of control. I don't know anybody who would not suggest that there's too much bureaucracy, that there are too many people, that there's too much overlap, and too much money is being spent on things where the American taxpayers are getting the short end of the stick. But
Elliot, how would you, when you say will it work, how do you define success for them?
How I define success is doing away with as much duplication and as much necessary government as they possibly can. Now, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, so that's a difficult thing to enforce. But if you come out of this and he's only cut $100 million or $200 million, I'd say the thing was a total failure.
You know, my way of defining success, Ray Dalio helped us with it in a book that he released this week, where he talks about that today, over the last 7 to 8 years, we've increased our deficits to about 7 to 7.5% of GDP. His point that he makes is we can survive at 3%, our deficit being 3% of GDP, but that at 7%, it gets to a point where in 10 to 15 years, the cost of what we're paying in interest is so high, it's problematic for the country in terms of bankruptcy.
What he's saying is you can inflate your way out of 3% overspending. You can't inflate your way out of 7.5%.
What does that mean, Elliot?
Well, if you're running these deficits and you have a 2.5%, 3% inflation economy, essentially that 3% gets washed out in the long run. Unfortunately, at 7.5%, you need 7.5% inflation to wash it out. That's not going to happen because in this country, there'd be revolt if inflation got that high for any extended period of time, and rightfully so.
Yeah, and my view of being in support, first, I was mayor. I've had employees that worked for us. We went from 14,000 employees to 11,000 employees during the period of time that I was there, and I don't want to say that no one got hurt. There was pain. There were good people who oftentimes suffered for that, and there are good people that work for the federal government too. I don't think it's fair to demonize all of them. My own personal opinion is it's not about harming them. It's about trying to make certain that we get to a goal. And the goal for me, I think Ray Dalio helped define it for me, is you need to get back down underneath that 3% level. I'd love to see it balanced. But if you can't get it balanced, at least get it to the point that we're not putting the country at risk. And I agree with you on this. The chance of this failing is probably going to be more from Republicans than Democrats, because Republicans, by keeping quiet, are effectively saying they're conceding to it moving forward. But you can start to see the tremors that are happening with people as they begin to see things cut in their areas. I agree with Bob on the mess that it's created. I mean, I would not have just wiped out USAID. I think that there are some programs in there that were beneficial to us, that helped us as a country. Now, I know that it's used by intelligence agencies and others oftentimes to put on leverage, but usually that leverage comes with a purpose. There was a reason for us doing that. But if you ask me, is that more important than being underneath this 3% number set by Dalio? No, I don't think there is anything more important than that. To me, that is a priority issue, and we have to find a way to be able to get to that. Your thoughts,
Elliot? But it's going to be messy.
I'll come back to you, Bob. Go ahead, Elliot.
That's all I can say is it's going to be messy. You're not going to find anything that doesn't have a constituency. Years ago, I read a book that basically said the weakness of democracy is that in a democracy, costs are specific, but benefits are just the opposite. Costs are diffused, but benefits are specific. So there's always a power base at the end of some program. It might cost you $3.25, but in the aggregate, it might be $5 billion. And you bet that there's a power base at that $5 billion. I don't see how we end up getting around that, unfortunately. I wish I was wrong.
If the goal is to reduce the annual federal deficit from 7% of GDP to 3% of GDP, then DOGE is irrelevant because it won't be dealing with the things that are necessary to do in order to achieve that result. You have to get the federal government is basically, for the most part, a giant income transfer machine. They collect taxes and then they send money out to seniors, to states and localities, to all sorts of people. And all of that is outside the writ of DOGE. I mean, if you can get a 0.5 percentage point out of DOGE, that would be a remarkable achievement. And it's not worth the mess, and it's not worth the lack of following the rules. We go back to the rule of law. Some of these are agencies that Congress has created. that the Trump administration is trying to unilaterally shut down.
And
That's
Bob,
what
let
supposed to
me
work.
ask you a question in the reverse, and then just so I understand your thinking. Let's just say that they were successful at cutting this down to 2%, our deficit being at 2% of the GDP, that they made substantial cuts. Let's just say that through this process that happened, knowing that there's still a mess, knowing that there are still challenges, and as maybe one of those challenges is they don't comply with the U.S. Supreme Court ruling, which hasn't come down yet, may not come down against them. I don't know, but how would you then see it? Would you see it as being worthwhile? My own personal opinion is it's worthwhile right until the point that you defy a U.S. Supreme Court order. And at that point, you really have created a constitutional crisis. But other than that, it seems to me they are living within the rule of law because effectively, while Congress passed these rules, Congress could, if you had a Democratic House, they'd be standing up saying, hey, we don't agree with this. Well, they're not because it's a Republican Congress, so they're letting it go. Any event. The main question I'd love to have you answer is if they were successful at making those cuts, would you be more supportive of the efforts even though there was a mess?
If they stayed within the law, which they're not currently doing, then yes. But Paul, it's mathematically impossible for the DOGE effort to get from 7% to 2%, because off the table are Medicare, Social Security, defense spending, which they're going to increase. They're not going to cut veterans' benefits. There's too much involved, not in administering the federal government, but the federal government acting as a bank, taking money in, sending money out. Unless you're going to change the money that goes out or the money that's coming in, you're not going to get the federal deficit down that much. It's just mathematically impossible, not improbable. It's mathematically impossible.
So I'd love to see where it's impossible, only because I believe that cutting it by 3% is about $1 trillion. Cutting it by $2 trillion, which would put us into a balanced budget, would be closer to the 7%. But I look at that and say, at $1 trillion, they may be able to get there. And I wasn't really altogether sure in the beginning, but as we're starting to see more of these cuts, I tend to agree. Well, first, I think with Donald Trump, there isn't any other ability to get it done other than through an Elon Musk. I think Bill Clinton would be able to get it done, and he did, right? Because he could pass legislation. I haven't seen Donald Trump ever be successful at passing legislation. Haven't seen him have the temperament to deal with legislation. If it's going to be done under the Trump administration, I think this is really the only way.
So Bob is right that for the federal deficit to get under control, which is absolutely a national priority, then the reform has to be of the big entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, other big transfer programs to the states. And honestly, even the military is not as important as those huge areas. And it's essentially impossible for Musk to directly have an impact on those. What I've always said about DOGE is that it could be a great thing for raising public awareness about the deficit and changing people's opinions about the deficit and forcing it up the priority list of voters, and therefore having an indirect effect on Congress people, and having the richest man in the world stand in the Oval Office next to Donald Trump and just outline a few of the crisis areas of the deficit and the federal spending is probably one of the best things that could have happened for moving the needle on public opinion around the deficit. But whether that translates into legislation in Congress is an open question, because as Bob pointed out, it kind of runs counter to a lot of Trump's priorities. Trump wants to cut taxes, which is going to increase the deficit, on net. He wants to take taxes off of Social Security rather than cut the spending on Social Security. And so I'm not optimistic that when the rubber really hits the road that we're going to see the impact on the bottom line federal spending that a lot of us really think is absolutely necessary. But perhaps there's a positive effect in terms of public awareness of this problem. That's what I'm kind of hoping for.
All right, Elliot, help us understand from an economic standpoint what we saw with the fall in consumer confidence this month. The poll that was done in Michigan showed about a 5% reduction, and then also an increase in the consumers' belief that inflation was going to increase by almost a full percent. Um, a lot of the talking heads have said that this relates to tariffs and to the risk of inflation, that's what people are more concerned about. Interestingly enough, in a poll that we put up last week, overwhelmingly, the single biggest issue that consumers cared about was lowering their costs. Now, I'm not quite sure how a president actually is going to reduce their costs, but I know how they could increase their costs. They could increase their costs with more taxes, more regulations, or more tariffs, which are kind of in the first category. But nonetheless, there's this drop going on in consumer confidence. You follow the economy on a regular basis. What's your thought about what's really happening here?
Well, like Bush said years ago, it's the economy, stupid. And the bottom line is for Trump to be considered a success, real GDP has to grow faster than it has been growing. Real incomes have to go up, which means incomes have to go up more rapidly than the rate of inflation. And basically, you have to start getting rid of regulation. Also, there's obviously immigration and what's going on in Israel and Ukraine. But the average person is looking at his pocketbook, always has, always will. Do I believe there's a chance that when things cool down, things will improve? 2% is a tall order, and I hope I'm wrong, but I think it will end up somewhere between 2 and 3. And keep in mind, the Fed there is talking about the deflator for personal consumption expenditures, less food and energy. So declining food prices and energy prices won't hurt that, but it's the ripple effect of these things that are going to hurt them. And my guess is that he has a few months to do it. It's only 4 weeks into his presidency. He's not really responsible, but I won't be able to say that at month 3 or month 4, that he really has a short fuse on getting some of this stuff done. But again, without getting real incomes up, he's going to get slaughtered in midterm elections.
All right. So, Elliot, a question that came up last week that I was hoping you'd be on to answer. It seems to me there's a connection between what's happening on the Fed short-term rate and what's happening with the 10-year rate. And the connection is this. If the 10-year rate believes that the Fed's not going to be successful at taming inflation, they're going to increase the 10-year rate. And so actually decreasing the short-term rate may be more problematic for us in things like home mortgages. Tell me, is that a flawed philosophy or a flawed belief? How do you see that?
The Fed controls short-term rates. It does not control the 10-year rate. And what you're seeing is the marketplace saying the Fed's got a way to go and that we haven't seen the policies suggested yet that are going to work. On top of that, the mortgage rate spread historically has been over the 10-year has been between 180 basis points and 220 basis points. It's at about 250 basis points now, which suggests that long-term investors beyond 10 years also don't believe that they're coming down meaningfully in the near term. It's going to be a problem because it's the marketplace that controls 10-year rates, not the Fed.
Bob, your thoughts on this whole thing going on with consumer confidence? And I think what I'd like to do here, I'm gonna put up a little tape, a little video. Just take a minute here to watch. It's a skit that was done on Trump's press secretary, and I'll give you the reason why I'm playing it here in a moment.
90% of babies born today will never know who your father is.
What, my father?
3 out of 4 kids get bullied, and only 2 of them deserve it.
What?
And there are people in Africa right now.
Was that it?
Yeah, there are people there now. You should know that, Michael. Read a phone. So can I do Elon's salute really quick?
No, don't
Okay,
do
fine,
that.
but hold this. I had to do his dance for work.
All right, I'm sorry, where do you work?
I'm the press secretary at the White House. It's just like, if people are so angry about DEI, it's like, well, stop drinking and driving.
So, okay, so here's my purpose in putting this up. This skit isn't all too far off what we're seeing coming out of the White House press. And my concern is, like, if I were going to have a press person today speaking to the press, I'd want somebody who was talking about economics almost constantly, someone who seemed very informed in it. Instead, we're in this position where, kind of at all levels, we're getting this information from people who are the least qualified of the Trump staff. And I don't believe that everybody in the Trump staff is not qualified. I mean, I think Marco Rubio is really an amazing Secretary of State. I think he has an amazing ability to make substantial improvements. I think the Treasury Secretary is a very good Treasury Secretary. I think there are a number of appointments that have been done on the technology side, but most of the focus is going to the people who are saying crazy things, oftentimes Trump himself. Do you see that as being connected to the economy in itself, long term or short term, excuse me, with the consumer confidence issue, or do you see there as being maybe they're not connected?
I don't think that it is a large political problem to have incoherent or economically illiterate press secretaries, particularly when we now have divided and segregated channels of communication and media outlets. I think it's reality on the ground, and I think it's even more sharp than Elliot described. I think we learned during the last year or so of the Biden administration that even rising real incomes after inflation incomes isn't sufficient to overcome the political problem that inflation represents. Even though people were nominally better off, they were politically angry at rising costs. And costs continue to rise. They've been stuck at 2.5% to 3% inflation rate for a considerable period of time, irrespective of what else happens in the economy. That's a big political problem. And I don't know the extent to which I believe in wage plus push inflation as opposed to it being a monetary phenomenon. But to the extent it is a real thing, then you are getting into sort of an unhealthy cycle if you keep pushing wages up to compensate for rising costs to try to keep real incomes in the positive factor. But politically, I think we've learned that's insufficient. Inflation is a political problem in and of itself, even if people are otherwise doing okay.
I absolutely agree with Elliot and Bob that a big part of Trump's legacy is going to be about growth. And that means GDP growth, real income growth. And at the moment, I don't see a real growth agenda emerging. I think that the tariff threats and rescinding of the tariff threats are in many cases just as bad as tariffs themselves because it just inserts a lot of insecurity into trade and into investment decisions by companies. So I think that's already probably on the margin bad for inflation, driving inflation up. And I don't see a big deflationary push from Trump at this point. And I hope that that's something that's going to come really soon. Not so much necessarily for Trump's political fortunes, but for American consumers. Because until the inflation rates start to come down, then we're not going to be able to see interest rates come down, as you and Elliot just suggested. And until interest rates come down, we're not going to see people's mortgage rates start to come down, their credit card loan rates start to come down. So people will start to see some significant relief on that front. And then, of course, looming in the background behind all of this is the fact that new home starts and apartment starts have essentially stalled out over the last couple of years because of the high interest rates. And we're seeing rents already start to stabilize and start to climb in some parts of the country. And that's really dangerous when you don't have any construction going on, any construction being completed at the moment. So I think inflation is a big, big risk for the economy, for consumers and workers. And it's definitely a political risk as well. And right now, I don't see the big de-inflation growth agenda. And I'd actually be interested to hear Elliot just list off a couple of things that Trump could do right now, right? If you said that within the next couple of months there has to be some movement on this, what would be the big levers that he can pull right away to try and get inflation under control?
Well, the reality is, in the short run, there aren't a lot of levers. Don't involve food and energy. The bird flu will pass. You can pump as much as you want, but that's not what the Fed looks at. It'll be good for headlines, but the Fed's not going to be lowering rates as long as the deflative personal consumption expenditures, less food and energy, is above 2%. And right now, you're right, it seems to be stuck there. And not only is it stuck there, but the Fed has painted themselves in a corner because that now is a number in everybody's mind. So it really is, in the short run, a catch-22. His policies have to be basically lower taxes, especially for corporations, and to do things that keep them investing in plant and equipment and that make their workers more productive. It's all about doing things that make the workers more productive, and that essentially is plant and equipment spending.
Wouldn't it also be fair to say if he actually was successful at lowering the budget, that would create some relief from an interest rate standpoint and an inflationary standpoint? And if he was able to be successful at reducing regulations, he actually may make improvements on the economy itself. Now, I don't know the time frames.
Well, one of the things that's interesting to me is, maybe I got this wrong, but I thought Ramaswamy was in charge of going after regulation, and that Musk was going after waste. And I think that waste is terrible. It's going to be tough to get rid of. Bad regulation would be easier to get rid of, but is somebody focusing on that? I don't know. I really, and all the mess that's gone on in the last several weeks, I just don't know. But he's going to have to do something that essentially creates an environment that we don't have right now. And that includes, by the way, more construction workers. How the heck are you ever going to get a balance in supply and demand for housing of any type if there aren't enough workers to build it? And nationally, about 14-15% are illegals. In Arizona, I'm sure it's much, much higher. And until that's resolved, it's going to be a mess. So can he do things? Yes, he can definitely do things. But in the very short term, couple of months, 2-3 months, not really.
All right, Elliot, let's jump to one of the ideas floated by the Trump administration this last week, which was a sovereign wealth fund. And I'm going to describe what I believe it is, and you take off after it if I'm heading down the wrong direction. There are two abilities. By the way, I had an offer from the Chinese sovereign wealth fund years ago on a deal that I was involved with. We ended up not doing it, but I was fascinated just to understand how their particular sovereign wealth fund worked. It seems to me that there are really two ways in which you fund a sovereign wealth fund. One is you have some type of surplus income. Maybe you assign, in some countries, they may assign gas revenues or oil revenues because the state owns the actual oil revenues themselves. And you utilize that to build wealth. But the other way is that you can do it by playing a game with the Federal Reserve. You basically utilize something that's the opposite of quantitative easing, where you say, hey, the federal government's going to step up and they're going to provide money for these assets. It'll just go onto the balance sheet. We'll provide more electronic credits to do it. First, is that your same belief of what a sovereign wealth fund does? And then I'm really interested in your thoughts on a sovereign wealth fund. Is this a good idea or a bad idea for the United States?
Again, maybe I have it wrong, and Bob, feel free to correct me. But a sovereign wealth fund shouldn't need it in a free market economy. You just shouldn't need it. You don't want government making these decisions. You don't want government allocating resources. It's a disaster anywhere show me one time in history when, in the long run, the government has been good at allocating resources versus the private sector allocating resources. You can't, because it's never happened. And so things like that, I'm hoping that disappears because it's just a bad idea.
Elliot, there is the case for the sovereign wealth fund in countries that have windfall rents, especially from oil and gas. And the problem with the oil and gas revenue is that it drives up inflation in the rest of the economy. So if you have all this money flowing into the economy from the oil and gas, then you get this so-called Dutch syndrome, which is inflation goes up, you see overinvestment in this one super productive sector, and actually the economy ends up growing slower, ironically, than if they'd never discovered the oil and gas in the meantime. So for countries like Norway that set up the sovereign wealth fund to basically house all this revenue and invest it globally to prevent the Dutch disease from taking hold, that's the argument for the sovereign wealth fund. My brother actually works for the New Zealand sovereign wealth fund. The New Zealand sovereign wealth fund was actually set up out of regular government expenditure. It was almost like a 401k for the nation. They thought that they could invest the money strategically globally and get a good return on it and use to pay New Zealanders pensions some point far into the future. And it's been somewhat.
How's that working for you?
I think that they do reasonably well, but the problem is because it's funded out of general expenditure, you depend on each successive government to keep investing. And as you know, every government has different priorities. And so some governments have reinvested money in it and some have not. And so it has a certain amount of money that it stewards and it does do reasonably well in investing that money, but it's not on anything near the scale of the Chinese or the Norwegian sovereign wealth funds. The Chinese sovereign wealth fund you could almost see as something like the Norwegian one, and that when the Chinese export growth took off, the amount of sort of revenue coming into the country was just so stupendous that they had enough money to set aside and to invest, and that's the Gulf as well. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc., have sovereign wealth funds as a way to stop this inflation from the oil and gas sector spilling over into the rest of the economy.
My thoughts on this when I get to a bottom line is this becomes a slush fund for politicians. And that's how I see it. At the end of the day, you won't be able to avoid it. Even if you thought Trump was brilliant and he could do it right and he could make certain that it worked well, he won't be here at the end of 4 years and there'd be someone else who's going to come in. And maybe it's going to be Joe Biden. I sure as heck wouldn't want Joe Biden being able to have something along that line, or the Senate or Congress or anyone else. Your thoughts on a sovereign wealth fund and what do you see as its chances politically?
I agree completely with Elliot. I think he stated it extraordinarily well. And if the accumulation of sovereign wealth is inevitable because it's a government-owned asset that is producing the return beyond what you can reasonably spend on financing the government, the way to handle it is the way Alaska does. You do a rebate of it to the citizens and then let them direct the investment, and that can occur overseas. It doesn't have to all occur locally to drive up the economy. I just don't know what the brakes are anymore on anything that Trump wants to do politically. It's a terrible idea. Republicans should be uniformly against it. But it seems to be something that Trump wants. I really think he's sort of thinking of legacy things. How do I expand the territory of the United States? Presidents that do that are noted in history. I think establishing a sovereign wealth fund to buy Greenland or create a resort in Gaza. I think he's serious about the idea. And I don't know if he pushes it strongly, that there will be the kickback that ought to occur reflexively among Republican members of Congress who ought to believe exactly in what Elliot was saying. We don't want the government directing investment. The pension plans that exist on the state have been hugely politicized in terms of their investment. We want to keep that in the private hands as much as possible, and this is a terrible idea, particularly for a country that's $36 trillion in debt. If there's any surplus revenue, why don't we start bidding that down a bit?
I've been thinking about this, trying to make certain that I have agency when it comes to Trump. I listen to both sides and how they define him. And I've tried to come up with kind of what my own thinking is as it relates to him. The right tends to, and I'm not talking about the far right, I'm just talking about people who support him. They tend to see him as being strategic, that everything is designed to get to some well planned outcome that he's after, and that he has a plan for how to do that, but that he's doing everything in a strategic way. Interestingly enough, on the Democratic side, I hear two points of view. One is there's no way that's happening because he's not smart enough. And the other thing that I hear from them is they actually agree. They just think that he has a very diabolical goal that he's trying to work towards, and that diabolical goal is it's Hitleresque, right? That he's trying to overthrow the United States in some maniacal way, trying to overthrow democracy. My view of him is that he's not first that cunning. In fact, I've said this in the past. I watched him during the 2016 to 2020, and there were so many people who said, "Well, if it weren't for COVID, he wouldn't have lost." And my answer is, no, no. If it weren't for the stupid things he said during COVID, he wouldn't have lost. He could have easily have been successful with COVID by just not making comments about, putting bleach up there and this is a Democratic hoax. I think my own personal opinion is there's some genius to Trump, but there's also a giant handicap. In fact, I think if you said to Donald Trump, we'll make you the richest man on the planet, and all you have to do is figure out how to get 65 to 70% of America to agree, he would say there's no way because it's America's fault. The answer is we've had politicians that have done that. John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, to differing degrees, different politicians have been successful at finding that. I don't think he can. It's not, he is not capable of being able to do that. I think he lacks real empathy. When every time a crisis happens, instead of talking about the people who've been harmed and creating an aspirational view for us about why we should be concerned about them first, and over time we'll come back to the answer, he immediately begins to drive partisan politics into it. I don't see it as being maniacal. I don't see it as being part of a bigger strategy. I see it as a handicap. I think it's just something he can't overcome. And we're going to have to deal with him and work with him and listen to him for 4 years. And I think that filter that we're putting this through is going to be important, because otherwise, the problem that I have with the right and the left filter is that it creates this total sense of angst for all of us about what's happening.
I view Trump as an agent of disorder. So my view of Trump, and actually since 2016, I think it's continued, is more just to try and understand the ways in which he's pushing different aspects of our politics and our economy and our culture away from this post-Cold War liberal order that I grew up under, that you all were successful under. And I think that transition is happening across so many different levels, from bringing working class, low income voters from the Democrats on the left to the Republicans on the right, to taking America from being this global force through the global war on terror and all these, really American hegemony, to America being isolationist. Those are just two of the big things that I observe. But I don't really view Trump in terms of the left and the right. I view him in terms of order and disorder. That's how I find it easiest to make sense of what's going on. And if I can detect a general direction, then I'm pretty happy. But mostly I just see, where is this disorder coming from? How are things changing from before? Where we're moving to is hard to say.
So on that, this reckoning that he thinks the United States has to go through, that may be more pro-isolationist, more pro-terrorist, more, if I were talking to Steve Bannon or even Henry Olson that we met with, I would say, yep, that's what they're doing. They're strategically, that's where they are. I think Trump personally just saw it as a means of winning. Hey, here's my way to get behind that blue wall and to be successful with telling that group of voters that, hey, you've been screwed over and I'm the guy that's going to save it for you. I, I don't, I mean, I think that he does have a leaning towards tariffs, definitely. but I'm not as sure that he's as strategic. Tell me again, from your standpoint, do you see him as being strategic on that issue, and he is really trying to move the country in that direction, the same type of direction that a Steve Bannon would move us towards?
Well, he's a politician, not a philosopher, or even a political scientist. So he wanted to win the election. He wants to win the election. That was his goal, right? And so
Mhm.
I think that in order to do so, he followed these policies that created this disorder, right? That led to a reduction in global trade, that led to the US pulling out of a lot of international agreements and entanglements. And I don't think that on his part there's a real deep philosophy behind it. He's doing what works. But you mentioned some of the people that are out there that have been advising him, and a lot of those people are thinking a lot more deeply about these things than he is. And my impression is that his administration is moving in that trajectory, even though he's not working across some playbook. The direction of travel is clear. It's towards disorder, towards the United States withdrawing its role in the world, and to this political realignment within the United States of low income voters moving from the left to the right.
It's all about, we're all old enough to remember this movie, Broadcast News. I'm mad
Mhm.
as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. Okay. He's tapped into that. I don't think, and by the way, I also think you guys are giving any politician too much credit. They don't know what the hell they're doing half the time. They're unrealistic. Their advisors are idiots. And that's just in general, okay? Just in general to politics. Do I think Biden's advisors were any better? Hell no. Do I think Obama's were? Hell no. Do I think that Bush's were? No, I don't. But the bottom line is that he has chosen a different course, a different way of looking at things, and he's going to shake things up and see what happens. Will he be successful on all this? On all of it? No. Will he be successful on some of it? Well, hopefully. Do we need that type of change? Well, we could spend weeks arguing that, but in my opinion, what we've been doing since we went into Iraq hasn't worked. Last 35 years, we've been doing things that didn't work. And all we do is compound it. But when a president feels, I'm going to do that because it's safe, it's what people are used to. I at least respect the guy because he's trying something different. And will he be successful? On some things, yes. On some things, no. But if I sit here today and you said, uh, put a gun to my head and say, tell me which ones are going to be successful and which ones won't, I'd say just pull the trigger now. I have no idea.
All right. Bob, I'll give you last comment on this.
I think a very high degree of angst is warranted. I think that Trump has a genius for right-wing populism, capturing it in a way that we have maybe never seen in this country. I think in terms of being a leader, he's an impulsive narcissist. He wants it all to be about him. He doesn't respect any breaks. And it's clear that on the international stage, he believes in a return to great power politics. And I would wholly concede Elliot's point that he is hardly the first president to push the edges at our constitutional order. And some of what Biden did was egregious. Some of what Obama did was egregious. But he will push our constitutional separation of powers and checks and balances more than any president in the post-World War II era. And I don't have the kind of confidence I would like to have that Republicans in Congress will stand up for the institutional role and integrity of that institution as part of the checks and balances. I have a higher degree of confidence that the U.S. Supreme Court will play its appointed constitutional role. But I don't have the kind of confidence I would like that Trump will regard himself as bound by that, and that if he doesn't, that Republicans in Congress will hold him accountable for that breach. So I believe a high degree of angst is warranted.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. We appreciate all of you guys and all you do. We will see you guys in a couple of weeks on our next show.
Thanks, Paul. So good to see you guys.
Good to be with you.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.